Elijah Lovejoy was a Presbyterian minister and newspaper editor who became the first martyr of the American abolitionist movement. Elijah Parish Lovejoy was born in Albion, Maine on November 9, 1802. He came from a deeply religious family. His father Daniel Lovejoy was a congregational minister and farmer who instilled in his children a strong sense of moral duty and Christian values. Elijah was the eldest of 9 children, and from an early age he showed exceptional intelligence and a passion for learning. The Lovejoy household was one of modest means but rich in faith and education. Young Elijah grew up in rural Maine during a time when the nation was still finding its identity, still working out the contradictions between the ideals expressed in the Declaration of Independence and the reality of human bondage that existed in the southern states. Elijah Lovejoy attended Waterville College, which is now known as Colby College, in Maine. He was an outstanding student, graduating at the top of his class in 1826. Lovejoy was known for his serious demeanor and his commitment to his studies. He was not one for frivolity or wasting time. After graduation, Lovejoy moved west to St. Louis, Missouri, seeking opportunity and adventure. St. Louis in the 1820s was a booming frontier city, a gateway to the West, a place where fortunes could be made and where the future seemed limitless. Lovejoy took a position as a school teacher and began to establish himself in this new environment. He was ambitious and hardworking, and he soon became involved in journalism, contributing articles to local newspapers. But something was missing in his life. He felt a spiritual emptiness, a lack of purpose that material success could not fill. In 1832, Elijah Lovejoy experienced a profound religious conversion. He attended a revival meeting and found himself deeply moved by the message he heard. He felt called by God to enter the ministry. Lovejoy returned east to study at Princeton Theological Seminary in New Jersey, one of the most prestigious institutions for training Presbyterian ministers. At Princeton, Lovejoy immersed himself in theology and biblical studies. He was ordained as a Presbyterian minister in 1833. But Lovejoy did not see his calling as simply preaching from a pulpit on Sundays. He believed that Christianity demanded action, that faith without works was dead, and that a true Christian must confront the moral evils of society. He was increasingly troubled by the institution of slavery, which he saw as a fundamental violation of Christian principles and human dignity. After completing his studies, Lovejoy returned to St. Louis in 1833. He became the editor of a religious newspaper called the St. Louis Observer. The Observer was a weekly publication that focused on religious news, moral instruction, and commentary on social issues. Lovejoy used the newspaper as a platform to promote temperance, education, and Christian values. Initially, he was cautious about addressing the slavery question directly. St. Louis was a slave state, and Missouri was deeply divided on the issue. Many of the city's most prominent citizens owned slaves, and the economy was tied to the institution in various ways. But Lovejoy could not remain silent for long. His conscience would not allow it. He began to publish articles that questioned the morality of slavery, that suggested it was incompatible with Christian teaching, that argued for gradual emancipation. The reaction was swift and hostile. Pro-slavery forces in St. Louis were outraged by Lovejoy's editorials. They saw him as a dangerous agitator, a troublemaker from the North who was trying to stir up discord and threaten their way of life. In April 1836, a horrific event occurred that pushed Lovejoy to take an even stronger stand. A free black man named Francis McIntosh was arrested in St. Louis and accused of killing a deputy sheriff. Before he could be brought to trial, a mob seized McIntosh from the authorities, chained him to a tree, and burned him alive. The lynching was a barbaric act of mob violence, and Lovejoy was horrified. He wrote a powerful editorial condemning the murder and calling for justice. He criticized the judge who seemed to excuse the mob's actions. This was too much for the pro-slavery establishment in St. Louis. They wanted Lovejoy silenced. The threats against Lovejoy intensified. He received warnings that his life was in danger. Pro-slavery mobs began to target his newspaper office. In July 1836, while Lovejoy was away, a mob broke into the Observer's office and destroyed his printing press. The press was thrown into the Mississippi River. This was a deliberate act of intimidation, an attempt to shut down his newspaper and drive him out of Missouri. But Lovejoy refused to be intimidated. He was determined to continue his work. However, he realized that St. Louis was no longer safe for him or for his newspaper. He made the difficult decision to relocate across the Mississippi River to Alton, Illinois. Illinois was a free state, and Lovejoy believed he would have more protection for his rights there. He thought that in a free state, he would be able to exercise his constitutional right to freedom of the press without fear of mob violence. Elijah Lovejoy moved to Alton in the summer of 1836. He established a new newspaper called the Alton Observer. Alton was a small but growing river town located about 20 miles north of St. Louis. Although Illinois was technically a free state, many of its residents, especially those in the southern part of the state, had ties to the South and were sympathetic to slavery. Alton itself was divided on the slavery question. Some residents supported Lovejoy's right to publish his views, but many others saw him as a threat to social harmony and economic interests. The city's business leaders worried that Lovejoy's abolitionist rhetoric would damage Alton's commercial relationships with the South. They feared that Southern merchants would boycott Alton if the city became known as a hotbed of abolitionism. Lovejoy continued to publish articles opposing slavery in the Alton Observer. His tone became more forceful and uncompromising. He was no longer calling merely for gradual emancipation, he was demanding immediate abolition. He argued that slavery was a sin, that it corrupted both the enslaved and the enslaver, and that it had to be ended without delay. Lovejoy also began to advocate for other controversial causes. He supported the rights of free blacks, he criticized racial prejudice, and he called for equal treatment under the law. These positions made him extremely unpopular with many of Alton's residents. They saw him as a radical, a fanatic, someone who was willing to tear apart the social fabric for the sake of his principles. In August 1837, a mob attacked Lovejoy's newspaper office in Alton and destroyed his printing press. This was the second time his press had been destroyed. Lovejoy ordered a replacement press, but when it arrived in September, another mob broke into the warehouse where it was stored and threw it into the Mississippi River. This was the third press that had been destroyed. The attacks on Lovejoy's presses were not random acts of vandalism. They were organized efforts by pro-slavery forces to silence him and shut down his newspaper. The mobs believed they were defending their community against a dangerous outsider who threatened their values and their interests. Lovejoy could have given up at this point. He could have left Alton, moved further north, or abandoned journalism altogether. Many people urged him to do exactly that. Even some of his supporters suggested that he should moderate his views or stop publishing altogether for his own safety. But Lovejoy refused to back down. He believed deeply in the principle of freedom of the press. He saw it as a fundamental right guaranteed by the Constitution, a right that could not be surrendered in the face of mob intimidation. He also believed he had a moral duty to speak out against slavery. He felt called by God to be a voice for the voiceless, to defend those who could not defend themselves. To remain silent would be to betray his faith and his conscience. Lovejoy ordered a fourth printing press. He and his supporters made plans to protect it when it arrived. They knew that another mob attack was likely, and they were determined to defend their property and their rights. A group of about 20 men, including Lovejoy, gathered at a warehouse on the night of November 7, 1837, to guard the new press. They were armed and prepared to resist any attempt to destroy it. Word spread through Alton that Lovejoy and his supporters were at the warehouse. A pro-slavery mob began to gather. The crowd grew larger and more aggressive as the night wore on. They demanded that Lovejoy surrender the press. They shouted threats and insults. The tension escalated. Around 10 o'clock that night, the mob attacked the warehouse. They threw rocks and fired shots at the building. Lovejoy and his defenders fired back, trying to protect themselves and the press. The mob brought a ladder and attempted to set fire to the roof of the warehouse. Elijah Lovejoy and another man stepped outside to push the ladder away. As Lovejoy stood in the doorway, he was struck by multiple gunshots. 5 bullets hit him. He staggered back inside and collapsed. His last words were, "My God, I am shot." Within minutes, Elijah Parish Lovejoy was dead. He was just 34 years old, 2 days short of his 35th birthday. After killing Lovejoy, the mob broke into the warehouse and destroyed the fourth printing press. They threw it into the Mississippi River, just as they had done with the previous presses. Then the mob dispersed into the night. The murder of Elijah Lovejoy sent shockwaves through the nation. It became a defining moment in the abolitionist movement. Lovejoy was hailed as a martyr who had died defending freedom of the press and opposing slavery. His death galvanized many people who had been sitting on the fence about slavery. It showed them the violence and brutality that lay at the heart of the pro-slavery cause. It demonstrated that slavery's defenders were willing to use murder to silence their critics. News of Lovejoy's murder spread quickly. Abolitionist newspapers published accounts of his death. Public meetings were held in cities across the North to condemn the killing and honor Lovejoy's memory. Many people who had been indifferent to the slavery question were moved to action by Lovejoy's martyrdom. The murder helped to transform abolitionism from a fringe movement into a more mainstream cause. It showed that the conflict over slavery was not just about abstract principles or distant plantations in the South. It was about fundamental American rights, about whether free speech and free press could survive in a nation divided over slavery. One person who was profoundly affected by Lovejoy's death was a young lawyer in Illinois named Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln was 28 years old at the time, serving in the Illinois state legislature. He was not yet an abolitionist, but he was troubled by the mob violence that had killed Lovejoy. Lincoln gave a speech in January 1838, just 2 months after Lovejoy's murder, in which he warned about the danger of mob rule and the importance of respect for law. Although Lincoln did not mention Lovejoy by name, historians believe that Lovejoy's murder was very much on his mind when he delivered that speech. Years later, as president, Lincoln would lead the nation through a civil war that would finally end slavery. Another person deeply influenced by Lovejoy's death was a young man named John Brown. Brown was a fervent abolitionist who believed that slavery could only be ended through violence. When Brown heard about Lovejoy's murder, he stood up in church and publicly dedicated his life to destroying slavery. Brown would go on to lead the raid on Harper's Ferry in 1859, an event that further pushed the nation toward civil war. The connection between Lovejoy's martyrdom and Brown's radicalization shows how Lovejoy's death reverberated through the years leading up to the Civil War. After Lovejoy's death, there was a brief attempt to hold his killers accountable. Several men were arrested and charged with rioting, but not with murder. The trial was a farce. The defendants were quickly acquitted. The jury and the community seemed to believe that Lovejoy had brought his fate upon himself by refusing to moderate his views. This failure of justice only added to the outrage felt by abolitionists in the North. It confirmed their belief that slavery had corrupted not just the South but also parts of the North, that it had created a culture of lawlessness and violence that threatened everyone's freedom. Elijah Lovejoy left behind a wife and a young son. His widow Celia Ann Lovejoy was pregnant with their second child when Elijah was killed. She gave birth to a son a few months after his death. Celia Ann struggled financially after losing her husband. The abolitionist community rallied to support her, raising money for her and her children. She eventually remarried and lived until 1874. Lovejoy's children grew up knowing their father as a hero and a martyr. His son Edward Payson Lovejoy became a minister like his father. Lovejoy's younger brother Owen Lovejoy was also deeply affected by Elijah's murder. Owen had been with Elijah in Alton during those dangerous months. He was there when Elijah was killed. Owen vowed over his brother's grave that he would dedicate his life to fighting slavery. Owen Lovejoy became a prominent abolitionist and a congressman from Illinois. He was a close friend and ally of Abraham Lincoln. Owen used his position in Congress to advocate for anti-slavery policies and to keep his brother's memory alive. He frequently spoke about Elijah's martyrdom and what it represented in the struggle for freedom. The warehouse where Elijah Lovejoy was killed no longer stands. The site is now marked by a monument commemorating his sacrifice. In Alton, Illinois, there are several memorials to Lovejoy. The Lovejoy Monument, a tall granite column topped with a statue, was erected in 1897 in the Alton Cemetery where Lovejoy is buried. The monument recognizes Lovejoy as a defender of freedom of the press and a martyr to liberty. In recent years, there has been renewed interest in Lovejoy's story and his significance in American history. Elijah Lovejoy's legacy is complex and multifaceted. He is remembered primarily as a martyr to the causes of freedom of the press and abolition. His willingness to die rather than surrender his principles made him a powerful symbol for those fighting against slavery. But Lovejoy was not simply a symbol, he was a real person with strengths and flaws. Some historians have noted that Lovejoy could be stubborn and uncompromising, that he sometimes seemed more concerned with principle than with practical consequences. His refusal to moderate his views or relocate to a safer place arguably led to his death and left his wife and children without a husband and father. Others argue that this criticism misses the point. They contend that moral courage sometimes requires exactly the kind of uncompromising stance that Lovejoy took. In their view, Lovejoy understood that certain principles are worth dying for, that freedom of speech and human dignity are not negotiable. If everyone had taken the safe and moderate path, slavery might have lasted even longer than it did. Lovejoy's martyrdom helped to inspire a generation of abolitionists who refused to compromise with evil. His death showed that the conflict over slavery was fundamentally a moral issue that could not be resolved through political maneuvering or gradual reform. Lovejoy's commitment to freedom of the press has particular resonance in modern times. He believed that a free press was essential to democracy, that citizens needed access to diverse viewpoints and vigorous debate in order to make informed decisions. He was willing to die defending that principle. In an era when freedom of the press is under threat in many parts of the world, and when journalists are sometimes killed for doing their work, Lovejoy's example remains relevant. He reminds us that press freedom is not an abstract concept but a concrete right that must be actively defended, sometimes at great personal cost. The story of Elijah Lovejoy also highlights the deep divisions that existed in America over slavery in the decades before the Civil War. These divisions were not just between North and South but also within northern states and communities. Alton, Illinois, a town in a free state, was nevertheless deeply hostile to abolitionism. Many Northerners were willing to tolerate slavery in the South in order to preserve national unity and protect their economic interests. They saw abolitionists like Lovejoy as troublemakers who were disrupting social harmony. This attitude of compromise and accommodation with slavery was exactly what Lovejoy refused to accept. He believed that slavery was evil and had to be opposed, regardless of the consequences. Lovejoy's religious faith was central to his abolitionism. He did not oppose slavery primarily on political or economic grounds but on moral and theological grounds. He believed that all human beings were created in the image of God and therefore possessed inherent dignity and worth. Slavery violated this fundamental truth by treating human beings as property. For Lovejoy, opposing slavery was not a political choice but a religious obligation. He saw himself as doing God's work, as being faithful to the gospel message. This religious dimension of his abolitionism gave him strength and conviction but also made him seem fanatical to those who did not share his faith or his interpretation of Christian teaching. The question of violence in Lovejoy's story is also worth considering. Lovejoy himself was not a violent man. He did not advocate armed rebellion against slavery. His weapon was the printing press, not the gun. However, on the night he was killed, he and his supporters were armed and prepared to use force to defend their property. This has led to some debate about whether Lovejoy was truly a pacifist or whether he believed that violence was justified in self-defense. Most historians conclude that Lovejoy believed in defending himself and his property against mob violence but did not support offensive violence or armed insurrection. He saw himself as exercising his legal and constitutional rights, not as starting a war. The failure of local and state authorities to protect Lovejoy is one of the most disturbing aspects of his story. The mayor of Alton and other officials were aware of the threats against Lovejoy. They knew that mobs had already destroyed 3 of his printing presses. Yet they did little to protect him or to hold the perpetrators accountable. After his murder, the authorities made only a half-hearted attempt to prosecute his killers, and the defendants were quickly acquitted. This failure of the rule of law showed that in communities where slavery was supported or tolerated, even basic rights could not be guaranteed. It demonstrated that the conflict over slavery was not just about the South but about whether free institutions could survive anywhere in a nation divided over such a fundamental moral issue. Elijah Lovejoy's death was not in vain. His martyrdom energized the abolitionist movement and helped to move the nation toward confronting the evil of slavery. It took another 24 years and a bloody civil war before slavery was finally abolished, but Lovejoy's sacrifice was part of the long chain of events that led to that outcome. He showed that some principles are worth dying for, that freedom and human dignity are not negotiable. His example inspired others to take up the cause and to continue the fight. In that sense, Lovejoy's death was not an ending but a beginning, not a defeat but a victory for the cause to which he had dedicated his life.